Zach Polanski has announced the Green Party's plan to tackle the affordability crisis and the end of food bank use. The Green Party has warned that the use of food banks in the UK has become normalised, pointing to the fact that around 6.5 million people a year turn to charitable food providers and that only 1 in 5 people doing so are from a working household. In 2025, 2.9 million emergency parcels, food parcels even, were provided to people facing hardship across the UK between April 2024 and March 2025, with more than 1 million of those provided for children. Green Party leader Zach Polanski and Deputy leader Rachel Millward will use a visit, and they have now used a visit, to a community fridge in Sussex that happened on Wednesday, and they announced measures to end the normalisation of food banks and tackle the affordability crisis. They will call for universal support with energy bills this winter, the extension of free school meals to all primary schools and secondary schools, the introduction of rent controls because housing costs are one of the greatest impacts on household poverty, the UK to join a customs union with the EU to reduce costs to businesses, and the introduction of a 10-to-1 pay ratio, which would help increase wages for those on lower incomes while limiting the salaries of high-paid executives. Now, it's that last point, the 10-to-1 pay ratio, which has got people talking. The 10-to-1 pay ratio is genuinely a stupid policy. So many sports like F1 and football would be well and truly destroyed. Others, like rugby and cricket, would be kneecapped. The first is ridiculous. Tesco employee could earn £14 an hour, and you want the CEO to work £140 an hour, then get taxed half? Nah. CEO of the company I work for is on about £2 million a year. 10-to-1 ratio doesn't put me and the other 15,000 employees on £200,000 a year. We're already on decent money. It just pushes the people at the top down, meaning they pass less tax, meaning we will have to pick up that lost tax burden. The Greens are utterly clueless. Although Alonso made an interesting point. We are witnessing an incredible new ideology emerge. Don't vote Green because their immigration policies will lower working class salaries by importing cheap labour, but also don't vote Green because their 10-to-1 policy will force businesses to raise working class salaries to please CEOs. Now, it's clear many people don't understand the pay ratio. It's not, a cleaner just getting on 50 grand a week. The point is to bring down the top pay, which is, the tweet by Max, they're right. Because inequality is a huge problem. And yes, some people are just paid too much. And that's the multimillionaires and billionaires. It's also worth pointing this out. Average annual national earnings increased from £788 in 1968 to £31,616 in 2022, compared with the increase in median CEO remuneration over the same period from £23,000 to £3,910,000. The ratio of CEO pay to average annual national earnings increased from 30-to-1 in 1968 to a peak of 178 in 2016. It fell during COVID to 87-to-1 in 2020, before rising again to 124-to-1 by 2022. So the idea of a pay ratio, it's radical, but when you look at how much inequality has exploded, you can understand why people are calling for it. Now, look, people in this country, they lean left when it comes to the economy. They support nationalisation. They support the increasing taxes on the rich. A lot of Green Party policies are popular, but is this one too radical for people? Well, maybe not. YouGov has just come out with a new poll, and that shows that people quite like this idea. So 41% of people support this policy strongly, 24% somewhat, which equals 65% of the public supporting a 10-to-1 pay ratio, with 17% opposing it. And of those 17%, 7% are those who are strongly against it. Now, being asked what you think the ratio should be versus implementing a policy to force it are two different things. I mean, the general public can be quite funny about this sort of thing. If a poll was conducted that said, do you support a policy of enforcing a 10-to-1 pay ratio? You might get a different result. It's also worth mentioning that this isn't a brand new policy. It was in their 2024 general election manifesto. Now, for me, principally, I think a 10-to-1 ratio sounds pretty based. But practically, how will this work? I mean, it can't be done over the night. Would the implementation of this policy have negative effects? There's a lot of questions that surround it. I think it should be a goal. we should be looking towards 10-to-1 pay ratio for sure. But how was that actually implemented? Would it not be better to have huge tax hikes on the wealthy, raise the minimum wage, and have stronger unions? It will be, a long-term approach to achieving a more appropriate pay disparity than we have now, instead of a policy that, again, could disrupt things negatively. Now, friend of the show, No Justice MTG, made a very good observation. As appealing as the 10-to-1 pay ratio policy is, it's just more intervention into the cure than the prevention. I personally prefer the inclusive ownership fund policy that fixes the root issues of firm ownership whilst not distorting incentives as much. Now, the inclusive ownership fund was proposed by Labour under Jeremy Corbyn. The policy required businesses with over 250 employees to give 1% of shares into a fund. Now, over time, this will be transferred over to the workers. And that is a real socialist policy, whereas a 10-to-1 pay ratio is a social democratic plaster on the economy. Kevin, what are your thoughts on this policy? I mean, it sounds good in terms of tackling inequality, but are there better ways of dealing with it? And do you think some people could be put off that it's a bit too radical for them?
I have no problem with the policy particularly. It's certainly a great deal better than what we currently have, which is essentially my feeling towards a great deal of the Greens policy platform. Whilst it's not perfect, it's a hell of a lot better than what we currently have, so I'm prepared to go with that. And so I'm not going to sort of principally oppose this plan, although again, as Helena pointed out in that tweet, there are better models for this. This is something of a sock dem sticking plaster, but it's a great deal better than what we have. I think I'd prefer to focus on the kind of optics of it, if you will. Now, obviously, you showed that poll where it suggested that nearly 2/3 of people somewhat or strongly support this. But I do have to question some of the findings of that, like the fact that 36% of Reform voters strongly supported the plan, even though it's literally it's a one-man party led by an ultimate Thatcherite neoliberal. So I don't quite get what those people are about. Maybe they're just economically socialist but very racist as well. I don't know. Whatever. But as you pointed out, I think that people, if they were asked the question about the force being used, the governmental force implementing this, rather than just as a theoretical proposal, would they support it? And I'm not entirely sure they would. Not because intrinsically they're against it, because as I think you pointed out, economically the people of Britain are relatively left wing. Or at least sort of centrist or vaguely progressive. I think the media would be able to run a successful smear campaign at the current time that would essentially Corbynize this thing. They would be able to smear it to the point where people would vote against their own best interests, sort of the ideal. And so, essentially, if there's one thing we can learn from the right wing's rise in recent years, and again, I'm not knowing about the policy of this, but just the practical kind of way in which you win public support and shift the Overton window, is the idea of hiding one's power level. So you have to meet essentially the working class where they're at, rather than where you want them to be, in order to try and bring them to where you want them to be. And so, putting something forward that is seen as more radical than is realistically implementable, given the media prism through which all of this gets filtered to the public, I think putting forward this policy, even though, like you say, it's been around for a while, doesn't necessarily work in the current context. I think it would be better to try and gradually introduce this, because we on the left, I think, have failed to understand the idea that if you're going to go down this path of electoral gradual change, of reform rather than revolution, or however you want to describe it, then you have to actually engage in national public discourse. People forget that when Jeremy Corbyn introduced the policy of the government paying for the laying of high-speed cable, internet cable in Britain, the media smeared it as broadband communism was the phrase that was used. It was smeared and derided and disgusted. The media ran a horrible campaign against it, but then within 2 years it became government policy, because the public got to hear the discussion. The public got to see that this policy was a thing, and they went, "Oh, okay, that's fine. Actually, we want that. That's a thing that needs to happen." And so, eventually, even the Tories had to implement this as a basic policy. Putting things on the agenda and allowing them to be discussed is a lot better than just putting forward the actual proposal that you have, which might seem dishonest, but we're talking about politics here. Hiding your power level is not about dishonesty as such. It's about allowing people the time and space they need to develop in their ideas, right? So putting forward the idea of absolute rent abolition which is a good policy, right now would be sort of untenable. Whereas if you put in rent controls and curtailment of the power of no fault eviction and things like that, you gradually get introduced to people the concept that the overweening power of the landlord can be challenged. And eventually they begin to realise, oh, actually, this improves my quality of life and those around me. And eventually you can get to the position where absolute abolition of landlordism would be a possibility. And I think the similar process would need to be undergone here. The neoliberalisation of the economy to the point where the supposed freedom to earn as much as you like, which basically comes at the expense of the vast majority of people, has been unquestioned for 40 years within the media and the political establishment, basically, other than under maybe Michael Foot and a little bit under Jeremy Corbyn. But by and large, it's been unchallenged. So people haven't even had the concept that you could say to the wanker bankers of London, no, you don't get to just earn unmitigated amounts of money for fucking over the economy. That isn't even a thing that people have been allowed to think within the zeitgeist. So introducing basic lower level policies to try and get people to the stage where a 10-to-1 ratio or a more worker based ownership reduction model would actually be viable, I think is the more effective way of going with this. And especially given that you're putting forward a perspective for government when you're not even fighting a general election yet. You're revealing policy when you don't need to. And so I think that the policy is perfectly fine, but the timing and way in which this has been gone about, I think, is possibly a little bit of an own goal.